So in chapter 21, we're going to discuss the origin and evolution of life. There is a lot of information in the textbook, in the reading, but I want you to focus on the information in this slideshow. And just remember that you usually won't discuss the origin of life really far into detail with elementary school kids. Think back to what we talked about with our big ideas of science. So early attempts at understanding the origin of life. Ancient cultures believed that life could be generated from non-living matter, and this is called spontaneous generation, so coming from nothing. Later experimental evidence proved that life can only come from other living things, and we call this biogenesis. So Francis Redi in 1668, his experiment was 2 jars with decaying meat, both exposed to the atmosphere, one covered with gauze and one remained uncovered. The flies would settle on the meat in the open jar, as you can imagine. Maggots eventually appeared on the meat in the open jar, however, they never appeared in the covered jar, which is conclusion that maggots came from the eggs of the flies, and that's why on the covered jar there was no life that was generated, the maggots, whereas the open jars they were. So Louis Pasteur in 1861 was the next big milestone. He placed fermentable sugar solution in a flask with a swan neck. The long swan neck opened to air to allow oxygen to enter. The mixture in the flask were boiled to kill any organisms that might be living in the solution. And he postulated that spontaneous generation would not occur even in the presence of oxygen. Organisms in the air caused fermentation. Organisms would settle out on the bottom of the curved portion of the neck and not reach the solution, and the sugar solutions would not ferment. He also cut off the swan neck, you see in the bottom left-hand side. Microorganisms reached the sugar solution and solution fermented over time, which shows us that spontaneous generation does not occur. There must be something in some source of life already existing. So the 3 domains of life are the eubacteria, the archaea. These are our prokaryotes, so they have the no nucleus, no true nucleus. Eukarya are the ones that have eukaryotic cells. The eubacteria are many different types of metabolic activities, heterotrophs, photoautotrophs, and chemoautotrophs. The archaea are primarily chemoautotrophs, usually found in harsh environments. They use inorganic chemicals to generate energy, and the reactions often produce methane or hydrogen sulfide. So these are things that live like in the volcanic underwater thermal vents. Those are the types of harsh conditions that these archaea will prefer. Now the eukarya are what we belong part of because we have a cell with a true nucleus. Plants, animals, fungi, protozoa, and algae are also part of this group. The cells are larger than that of the prokaryotes. Cells appear to have incorporated cells of other organisms. And so what does that mean? How do we go from prokaryotes to eukaryotes? Well, the theory is that it's called the endosymbiotic theory. Eukaryotic cells are thought to come from combining several different types of prokaryotic cells, and so some eukaryotic organelles may have originated as free-living prokaryotes. Cells formed a symbiotic relationship, they adapted, reproduced as a team, and evolved into present eukaryotic cells. And so some examples are mitochondria and chloroplast. And so the idea is that the cells would have basically ingested each other, and then as a team developed into a fully functional eukaryotic cell that we know as of today. So let's talk about natural selection. Evolution is obviously a hotbed issue, but the thing is evolution is the continuous genetic adaptation of a population, so we're not talking about an individual, but a population of organisms to its environment over time. It involves changes in the genes present in a population, but not individual organisms. Natural selection is the process that encourages the passage of good genes and discourages the passage of harmful genes to future generations. And we'll talk about some natural selection. The theory of natural selection proposed by Darwin and Wallace is that individuals whose genes combinations that favor life in their surroundings will be likely to survive and pass their genes on to the next generation because they have the genes that make them the most fit. The theory of evolution is that populations of organisms become genetically adapted to their surroundings over a period of time. Natural selection brings about evolution by selecting which genes are passed on. So there's kind of a process in which natural selection then undergoes genetic selection, which then over time turns into evolution of a population. So, what are some misinterpretations associated with natural selection? One is that survival of the fittest is the key, but survival alone is not good enough. Survival and reproduction is the key. So, not only is it important to survive, but it's important to be able to reproduce. The other one is the struggle for life, and this is not necessarily open conflict, but finding the necessary resources for survival and reproduction. So we're going to stop here, and then you'll pick up on genetic diversity and finish chapter 21 on the next class.